Audio lecture of Unit 5, Contemporary West, the French Revolution and the Age of Napoleon. French Revolution, Part 1. We're going to start with the background to the Revolution, and it is directly connected to what happened in the aftermath of the American Revolution. The French Revolution and the beginning of a new United States of America, meaning the government that we established after the Revolution was over, these things both happened in 1789, and both of them had far-reaching consequences. Both long-range problems and immediate forces caused the French Revolution. The long-range problems concerned the condition of French society. It was based on inequality, as feudalism always had been. Even though technically the, quote, feudal system is no longer really in place, there are still remnants of feudalism when one looks at the lives of the peasantry. France was divided into three orders or estates. These are like classes in French society. The first, the second, and the third. About 130,000 people made up the first estate, which was the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church. The clergy were exempt from the taille, which was France's chief tax. They didn't have to pay it. The second estate was the nobility of France, and they had about 350,000 people incorporated in that estate. They held many of the leading positions in the state and had their own privileges. Now, I realize that this is different than what we were saying under Louis XIV, the absolute monarch. But by the time we get to 1789 with Louis XVI, the French nobility had regained some of their power and had been able to start manipulating the king, Louis XVI, who was a much weaker king than his great-grandfather had been. Nobles wanted to increase their power at the expense of the monarchy. Now on to the next slide to learn about the next class. The third estate were the commoners, and this was basically 98% of the entire population of France. The third estate was actually divided up itself by differences in occupation, education, and wealth. So the breakdown of the third estate would be like this. Peasants were about 75 to 80% of the total population. And serfdom had been abolished, yes, but peasants still had obligations to landlords, or what we call relics of feudalism, that they resented, including paying most of the tax burden in France. The next level would be artisans, shopkeepers, and other wage earners. They're another part of the third estate. They were ones that were also hurting economically from a rise in prices because their wages did not increase when the prices increased. So higher prices ultimately hurt them more than anything. And they were ready for a revolution. And of course, the upper echelons of the third estate, in other words, the top of the third estate, would be the bourgeoisie or the middle class. They were another part of the third estate. They made up about 8% of the total population of France, and they owned about 20 to 25% of the land. Most of the land was still in the hands of the nobility because those were inherited lands. Now, the third estate, these bourgeoisie part of the third estate, were merchants, teachers, and other professional people, businessmen, business owners, lawyers, doctors, etc. They were also very unhappy about the privileges given to the nobles. Both aristocrats and members of the middle class were actually drawn to the political ideas of the Enlightenment, but more so the middle class than anyone else. The opposition of these elites to the existing order led them to drastic action against the monarchy. So we will see these upper middle class folks that had been influenced by the Enlightenment ideals are going to try to put those Enlightenment ideals into action. And this starts the French Revolution. The immediate cause of the French Revolution was the near collapse of the government's finances. The French economy suffered a series of crises for about 50 years, and the number of poor reached as high as 1/3 of the population. The poor lived in absolute squalor. And what I mean by poor here is basically homeless and nothing to their name at all. They're the lowest of the third estate. The French government continued to spend lavishly on wars and court luxuries at the Palace of Versailles, and the Queen, Marie Antoinette, was especially known for her extravagance. She was often referred to as the nickname Madame Deficit. The government of Louis XVI was finally forced to call a meeting of the Estates General, the French Parliament, if you will, although they weren't really a legislative body. They were an advisory body only. And this Estates General had not met since 1614. This is an embarrassment to Louis XVI to have to call upon the Estates General for advice on how to resolve the fiscal crisis, because an absolute monarch is not supposed to have to ask anyone's help for anything. Obviously, he was not as absolute as he hoped he could be. Now, one of the things that leads to the financial crisis of France is all those wars that they had fought earlier on in the century, including the 7 Years' War and, of course, bankrolling the American Revolution. Each order of French society had representatives that came to the meeting of the Estates General in Versailles. In order to fix France's economic situation, most members of the Third Estate wanted to set up a constitutional government that would abolish the tax exemptions of the clergy and the nobility and make it more equitable for all. They were not at this point talking about getting rid of the king, but perhaps establishing a constitutional monarchy like they saw in England. The Third Estate was much larger than the other two, though, since it represented 98% of the population, and the bourgeoisie were the leaders, of course, of the Third Estate. The Third Estate, because they had been indoctrinated by Enlightenment ideals, meaning those bourgeoisie had been indoctrinated, it favored a system of each member voting in the Estates General, a vote by head, if you will, since they represented 98% of the population and they had a larger group there representing their estate. But the king upheld the traditional voting method of one vote per estate, meaning the clergy would get one vote as the first estate, the nobility would get one vote as the second estate, and the Third Estate would get one vote as just one estate. This, of course, would mean that the clergy and the nobility, who had all those tax exemptions, who had all those privileges, they were not going to vote to end those privileges for themselves. So the Third Estate realized that nothing would get done in their favor. The Third Estate reacted by starting to refer to itself as the National Assembly and deciding to try to draft a constitution on their own. This happened largely because Louis XVI, when he said he would not change the voting rights, decided to lock the members of the Third Estate, the delegates, out of the meeting. So they decided to meet on a nearby tennis court. As I said, they were locked out of their meeting place and they moved to a tennis court next door. There, they swore they would continue to meet until they had finished drafting a constitution. This is known as the Tennis Court Oath of 1789. With this action, we see the beginning of the French Revolution. This oath, as I said, the Tennis Court Oath. The commoners saved the Third Estate from the king's forces. Okay? Ultimately, what happened is the Third Estate representatives that are now calling themselves the National Assembly, those bourgeoisie members, moved their meeting from the tennis court to Paris, the capital city, so they could begin drafting a constitution. This, of course, was not something that the king wanted, nor did most of the Second or First Estates. But the Third Estate, because they were influenced by Enlightenment ideals, they did open the door to invite any members of the First and Second Estate who wanted to join them in their creation of a new government for France. Some will join, most will not. The commoners that were living in the city of Paris, the working class poor, actually helped to protect the National Assembly from the king's forces when he sends in forces to try to stop them from meeting. The commoners ultimately ended up storming and dismantling the Bastille, which was a royal armory and prison in Paris. This is where the weapons would be kept, and they knew that this is where the royal forces would be headed, so they could go and get those weapons and then perhaps try to browbeat the National Assembly into giving up their revolution. Local revolutions then broke out because the king's authority started to collapse. These local revolutions all over France were against the entire landholding system. Peasant rebellions took place and became part of what's known as the Great Fear, a vast panic that hit France in 1789. All of these things will be better explained in your packet and in your textbook as well for extra information. Fearing invasion by foreign troops who supported the monarchy, including the brother of the queen, who also is the brother-in-law of the king, the Emperor of Austria, that is, Joseph II, people in the countryside started to form militias in case they needed to defend themselves and, of course, defend the revolution. The destruction of the old regime. One of the National Assembly's first acts was to destroy the relics of feudalism or aristocratic privileges. In August, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. This was in 1789 still. This declaration proclaimed freedom and equal rights for all men, access to public office based on talent, not on class, and an end to exemptions from taxation due to class. These were all influenced by the Enlightenment. All citizens were to have the right to take part in the making of laws through electing representatives to the National Assembly that would now act as a legislature to check the power of the king. Freedom of speech and freedom of press were also recognized, and the question arose eventually whether all citizens that was quoted in the document meant women as well. Many deputies said it did, as long as women stayed out of politics. But folks like Olympia de Gouges would not accept this exclusion of women from political rights, such as the vote for the National Assembly. She wrote a book called The Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen, where she tried to explain why women should be included in this new experiment with constitutional government in France. The National Assembly, however, ignored her plea. Yes, they were influenced by Enlightenment ideals, but they were not going to go so far as to grant equal rights to women. The destruction of the old regime continues, and Louis XVI stayed at Versailles, hoping that it would all go away, kind of burying his head in the sand. He refused to accept the laws that the National Assembly was passing. He refused really to recognize that the National Assembly was the legislature for France now. He refused to give up his absolute power. Ultimately, things will come to a head in the fall of 1789, in October, when an economic crisis ultimately happened, got worse, I should say, because of a crisis, a famine. Thousands of Parisian women, armed with pitchforks, swords, muskets, and the like, marched to Versailles because they were tired of the price of bread being so high. This is sometimes known as the Women's Bread March. Why women led the charge? Well, if you think about it, women are the ones who have to watch their babies starve to death. They're responsible for feeding their children, and they can't. They were fed up with this. They were desperate. Mama bears on patrol. A delegation of these women will meet eventually with Louis XVI, and they told him how their children were starving. And they eventually forced the king to accept new decrees and to open up the grain stores that he had stored up in Versailles. At the crowd's insistence, the royal family had to return to Paris, escorted by thousands of women with pikes. The king and queen and their child, the Dauphin of France, who is the prince, okay, the next one in line for the throne, would now have to live pretty much under house arrest in the old palace in Paris before Versailles was built. As a goodwill gesture, like I said, the king also brought along flour and other grain from the crown's storerooms in Versailles. This is the whole part when Marie Antoinette supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." What she meant by that was, why are they crying for bread? Why don't they just eat cake like I do? It just showed how out of touch she was with the plight of the poor in her country. She had absolutely no idea. She was a spoiled brat who did not know anything. The royal family was virtually held prisoner in Paris from this point on in the revolution. Since the church was also a pillar of the old order or the old regime, it too needed to be reformed according to the National Assembly's desires. So the National Assembly seized and held the lands of the church first and foremost. Bishops and priests were to be elected by the people instead of being appointed by other church officials or by the royalty itself. And ultimately, they would become a branch of the government, paid by the state. Because the French government now controlled the church, many Catholics became enemies of the revolution because it was seen by those clergy that if they agree to these terms, that they are going against the will of their liege lord or pope. Ultimately, they were between a rock and a hard place. If they accepted these terms, they could survive in France, but they would be considered excommunicated by the pope and ultimately damned. But if they didn't accept the terms of the National Assembly, then they would be considered traitors to the new French government, and they would be probably put on trial for treason and executed. Ultimately, after forcing the clergy to kowtow to their demands, many of whom left France rather than accept these demands, the National Assembly then started to adopt the Constitution. Now, they had been writing the Constitution since the summer of 1789. It will finally be unveiled in the spring of 1791. It takes some time sometimes to write a Constitution, especially if you're having to fight against the king time and again as well. So, the Constitution of 1791 set up a limited monarchy with a king and a legislative assembly with power to make laws. The National Assembly and the Legislative Assembly are basically the same thing. It's just two different names for the same thing. It is the legislature of France. In other words, they had established a constitutional monarchy. Only the most affluent members of society, though, could be elected to the National Assembly. Now, I'm not talking the nobles necessarily, although there will be some that will come along with the National Assembly. But what I am talking about is the wealthiest members of the Third Estate, those bourgeoisie. They are now firmly in the driver's seat and basically controlling everything. Yes, there's still a king at this point, but as we will see, he's not being very cooperative, and eventually is going to lead to his downfall. Only men over 25 who paid a specified amount of taxes were allowed to vote. And by 1791, with the adoption of the Constitution of 1791, the old order was destroyed. No more absolute monarchy in France. Many people, including Catholic priests, nobles, and lower classes, were hurt by economic hard times, and they opposed the new order, however. They didn't like losing their influence in society. Even the king himself showed that he was not in favor of being a constitutional monarch by trying to flee France. The thing was, he was trying to leave France to get to a border area where his brother-in-law's forces from Austria would help him march back into Paris and restore him to his absolute authority. By this point, Joseph II, Emperor of Austria, had died, and his brother Leopold was the emperor. Leopold, of course, is another brother of the Queen Marie Antoinette. So anyways, the king tried to flee France. This is sometimes known as the flight to Varennes. You'll see it in your textbook. But he was captured. He was recognized and he was returned back to France. And the Legislative Assembly met for the first time in 1791 as the new true legislature of France. After the king was forced to come back to Paris, he was now really put under arrest. And the assembly is now going to have to make a choice whether or not they're going to maintain him as a constitutional monarch, because he obviously was not sincere in going along with them, or if they were going to have to maybe try a different kind of governing structure. Many were now calling for a republic to get rid of the kingship altogether in France. When these kinds of grumblings started to be made public, other European monarchs, including the rulers of Austria and Prussia, threatened to help Louis XVI remain on the throne if the revolutionaries or the National Assembly did not maintain him on the throne. So now we have war with other nations in Europe being threatened on the new government in France. In response, the Legislative Assembly decided that they would beat them to the punch and they would declare war on Austria first. Now the French Revolution has taken on a whole different flavor, because now France is at war against Austria, and eventually that will also include Prussia. And now, in order for the French Revolution to survive, they are going to have to make sure that Louis XVI will never be able to be put back in absolute power by his allies outside of France. Now things have gotten even more dicey for the revolutionaries in France. France lost some battles with Austria, and distrust began to grip France because they had to raise their own armies. They didn't have the king's armies. And a lot of these people were not professional soldiers. It will take a while for them to be trained and organized. Defeats in war, as well as the economic shortages that continued, led to new political demonstrations happening in France. Radical groups formed the Paris Commune in Paris and organized a mob attack on the royal palace and the Legislative Assembly. They were fed up with the king, yes, but they were also fed up with the bourgeoisie who were in charge of the National Assembly, who did not seem to be doing enough to alleviate the financial crisis that, of course, hurt the lower classes the most. They captured the king and they demanded the end of the monarchy. The French Revolution was about to enter a more radical phase. Power went to the Paris Commune that was in the hands of these working class folks in Paris. Many of these people were known as the sans-culottes, or ordinary people without fancy clothes. Sans-culotte actually means without pants. It's not that they didn't have pants. It's that they were wearing long trousers, working class trousers, rather than the knee breeches that the wealthy classes wore, that the nobility wore, and now even members of the bourgeoisie wore them. The sans-culottes were made up of working people and the poor, as well as merchants and artisans who were the elite in their own little neighborhoods in Paris. We see this move towards radicalism continue when the Minister of Justice, Georges Danton, will use the sans-culottes as a means to get more and more power for the radical groups in the revolution who support getting rid of the king. Okay, so led by this Minister of Justice, Georges Danton, the sans-culottes sought revenge on those who had aided the king and resisted the popular will to maybe continue just having a constitutional monarchy. Thousands of people were arrested and massacred in September of 1791. One of the more important radical leaders was Jean-Paul Marat, who published the radical newspaper or journal, as it's called here, the Friend of the People. Marat would use this newspaper to point fingers at people that he saw as enemies of the Republic, or as enemies of the revolution, I should say. And ultimately, because he had the power of the pen, he was able to wield that power to get the mobs to do whatever he wanted. He would make suggestions that people were displaying anti-revolutionary activity by saying stuff like "Vive le Roi," meaning "Long live the king." And the next day, the names that he named would mysteriously end up dead. The mobs would get them. This is mob violence. This is not due process of law at all. And this shows you that the revolution is turning more radical. He argued that the poor had a right to take from the rich whatever they needed as well, even if they needed to use violence to do it. He who controls the mobs can control the revolution. In 1792, the National Convention met, acting not only as a constitutional convention, but also as a sovereign ruling body. Its first act was to officially end the monarchy and establish the first French Republic. They have finally decided to get rid of the king in France. Now, the king is still in prison at this point, and he will not suffer death at this point, but by early 1793 he will. This is because members in the National Convention disagreed over the king's fate. There were basically two factions or dissenting groups, okay? Both of them are part of a larger Jacobin political club, but the Jacobin club splintered into two segments, two different groups, factions. The urban folks were members of the Mountain Party, okay? That means the city dwellers. And the rural folks were members of the Girondins, okay? The Girondins wanted to keep the king alive, even though they agreed that a republic was the best thing, but they didn't want to kill the king. They wanted to just keep him in prison. The Mountain, however, wanted the king dead. And they are the ones that won out because the mobs of Paris, the Paris Commune, ultimately ended up supporting that idea, the more radical idea. So the king will be beheaded officially in January 1793 using a new tool called the guillotine, because it was thought to be a way more humane way to cut off someone's head. Instead of whacking away at somebody's neck with an axe, the weight of the blade would fall because of gravity and lop the head off, severing the spinal cord instantly, and supposedly the victim would feel no pain. Interesting to think that something like this is actually influenced by the Enlightenment. The split between the two factions in the Jacobin Club actually got Marat, a Mountain, killed eventually. Charlotte Corday, who was a member of the Girondin faction from the rural communities, ended up sneaking into Paris and stabbing him to death in his bathtub while he was taking a soak to alleviate his skin condition. Ultimately, Charlotte Corday thought that Marat had grown too powerful, too much of a demagogue in the Jacobin faction as this mountain part of the Jacobins, and she was concerned, as were many, that this would lead to chaos and more brutality in the streets. So she had him assassinated. She assassinated him herself. This, of course, will stir up more trouble, and the revolution will continue to become more and more radicalized. France had other domestic problems besides a split in the National Convention, which is what is now called instead of the National Assembly. The Paris Commune, like we talked about before, those working class poor people, those sans-culottes in Paris, began to pressure the convention to enact more and more radical measures. They were like a civic organization, if you will, that was pressing the elected officials to do more. And parts of France actually started to refuse to accept the rule of the convention. The Paris Commune gained more and more support, even outside of Paris, and the National Convention seemed to be losing ground. A foreign crisis also loomed because the execution of the king outraged those European monarchies even more. Now we know that France was already at war with Austria, but now even more nations, Prussia and eventually others, will get involved as well. They do not like what they see happening in France. They worry about the implications that it could spread to other nations. And even England, that had a constitutional government, did not like the idea of the king being killed, even though they did the same thing 150 years earlier to Charles I, mind you. Anyhow, Spain, Portugal, and Britain and other monarchies ultimately formed a loose coalition to invade France, to try to force an end to the madness that the revolution had now spun into, this radicalism, and perhaps force them to go back to some kind of constitutional monarchy, putting another member of the royal family back on the throne. To respond, the National Convention recognized that in order for the revolution to survive, they were now going to have to fight a war against all of these nations in Europe. So the National Convention formed a 12-member Committee of Public Safety, led first by Danton, but then by Maximilien Robespierre, both of which were Jacobins. Danton ultimately had become one of the leading members of the Girondist Party, and Maximilien Robespierre, the Mountain Party. Robespierre was a lawyer and activist, so known for his honesty that he was called the Incorruptible. But boy, will he become corrupt in the coming years. Robespierre followed Rousseau's ideas that he had written about in his book, The Social Contract, that we talked about in the previous unit. And he believed that anyone who would not submit to the, quote, general will, as he interpreted it, should be executed. Now, why does he get to interpret the general will? Because he was the head of the Committee of Public Safety that was put in charge of the war effort against the other nations in Europe. And he was also now one of the leading figures in the National Convention that was elected by the people, although it was not elected by all the people, as we know. So ultimately, he felt that he had the ability to say that what he wanted was what was the best for the rest of the nation, and that it was the general will. So this is why the Reign of Terror begins, and Robespierre virtually becomes a dictator in France. From 1793 to 1794, the Committee of Public Safety and the National Convention tried to defend France from foreign and domestic threats. At home, they began what became known as the Reign of Terror. And this is where they would use spies to root out anyone that was seen to be against the will of of Robespierre and the National Convention. Revolutionary courts prosecuted enemies of the revolution, and close to 40,000 people ended up being killed during this time period between 1793 and 1794. These were French people. These were people that had originally supported the French Revolution in the early phases when they were trying to form a constitutional monarchy. These were not people that were nobles and clergy. Most of them had left France smartly by this point. These were regular common folk mostly. Anyone who had opposed sans-culotte and the radical nature of those living in Paris could be a victim. So a lot of the peasants from the countryside ultimately ended up falling prey to the Reign of Terror because they didn't like some of these radical ideas. They wanted land, they wanted protection, they did not want radicalism. They did not want, their clergy members that they looked up to be bullied and become a branch of the state government. These are all things that concern many people. And ultimately, the radicalism led to all of these deaths. Robespierre being in charge, he ultimately is responsible for these deaths. Revolutionary armies, however, will have to continue to be sent to fight against not just the foreign factions, but sent to subdue rebellious cities within France. So this French Revolution during this Reign of Terror is being fought on two fronts. It's being fought internally to get rid of those who are seen as counter-revolutionaries within France, as well as fighting against the exterior enemies of France, meaning the foreign enemies of France, those other nations in Europe. For example, one of the rebellious cities that was made an example of by the Reign of Terror was the city of Lyon. About 1,880 citizens were executed, and much of the city was completely destroyed by the National Convention's forces, by the new French army that was made up of common people. In the city of Nantes, the revolutionary commander executed his victims by sinking them in barges in the Loire River. Clergy and nobles made up only 15% of the terror's victims. The rest were members of the Third Estate, mostly lower class peasants and working class poor. As it says here, the rest were bourgeoisie and peasants, most of them being peasants and working class poor. The National Convention established eventually, however, a military school to train young men to be patriots, to serve in the new National Guard that would have to continue to fight this war against the rest of Europe, to maintain French sovereignty and to make sure that the revolution stayed alive. Its thousands of recruits were to have high moral standards and be enthusiastic patriots for the revolution, but most of them just wanted to go home. The plan to train patriots ultimately failed. Many of these young men turned against the revolutionaries responsible for the Reign of Terror. The committee took other steps, the Committee of Public Safety, that is, took other steps to control France and bring order. This, remember, is under the authority of Robespierre. The committee called the new order of the Republic of Virtue, a democratic republic of good citizens, under the authority of Robespierre, quote, the incorruptible. The titles citizen and citizeness replaced Mr. and Madame. Agents were sent all over France to implement laws dealing with the wartime emergency. The Committee of Public Safety also tried to establish price controls on necessities like bread, though the controls often failed. This was their attempt to alleviate the financial crisis that was still going on as we're in the midst of fighting a war against all of Europe and trying to maintain order at home to get rid of counter-revolutionaries at home. It was a mess, folks. The women who convinced Louis XVI to return to Paris back in 1791 with the Women's Bread March stayed involved in the revolution. By 1793, two women founded the working class Society for Revolutionary Republican Women, and they were ready to actually take up arms and defend France themselves if need be. Most of the men continued to believe that women, however, should not participate in politics or fight. To establish an order built on reason in this Republic of Virtue, the National Convention, that is now also under the authority of Robespierre, so he's in charge of the National Convention and the Committee of Public Safety, which means he's virtually a dictator at this point, they had a de-Christianization policy in place. The word saint was removed from street names and churches were closed. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was rededicated as a temple of reason. And also a new calendar was adopted to take away the Christian elements in the calendar. Years were numbered starting from September 22nd, 1792, which was the first day of the French Republic, and not from Christ's birth. The calendar contained 12 months still, with each month having 3 weeks of 10 days, with a 10th day as a day of rest. This practice would eliminate Sundays that were, of course, associated with the Christian religion. So this was a way that the secular focus of the Enlightenment was taken to the extremes. Now, the secular focus of the Enlightenment did say that they wanted to get rid of organized religion, but they weren't saying to get rid of faith altogether. This de-Christianization is one of the things that did not sit well with the peasantry in France, who had originally supported the revolution to get a better say, you know, and not have to pay so many taxes. But this had gone a little too far. Robespierre realized, however, that France was too Catholic to be de-Christianized pretty soon when local populations started to rebel against these kinds of measures. To save the Republic from foreign nations, though, the Committee of Public Safety, also remember under the leadership of Robespierre, called for a universal mobilization of troops in 1793, a call to arms, if you will. And by September of 1794, France had raised an army of over 1 million men, and they had begun training them, and they started to win battles. It pushed the countries invading France back across the Rhine River and even conquered the Austrian Netherlands, claiming them for France. The French Revolutionary Army changed the nature of modern warfare forever and was an important step in creating modern nationalism. Promotion by merit rather than by rank was a big deal. You could work your way up through the armed forces by doing good things on the battlefield. You were recognized for your talents and you could be promoted. Previously, small armies fought wars between governments and ruling dynasties. The new French army was a people's army, fighting a people's war on behalf of a people's government. Warfare also became more destructive as a result of this. But France had defeated many of its foreign foes by the summer of 1794. Looked as if things might be looking up on that front anyways, on the international front. But what about at home? What about the chaos at home? Robespierre had become obsessed by this point, by 1794. He was obsessed with ridding France of its domestic enemies. He became paranoid, seeing enemies of the revolution everywhere within France. Anybody who spoke out against his drastic policies was considered a counter-revolutionary and a traitor. So eventually, only then, he believed that only by getting rid of these people could a true republic of virtue exist. So more and more blood was spilling. Many deputies of the National Convention started to fear the power of Robespierre and started to think that perhaps it was time to take him out. And so eventually they will react against him. The ones that were left, he had cleaned house in the convention a bit too. And eventually they were able to launch a secret plan to execute him. They captured him, put him on trial for crimes against the state. This is known as the Thermadorian reaction after the new name of the month where this was taking place. It was in the summer, so Thermador meant hot, okay? And Robespierre would be executed. With the execution of Robespierre by the guillotine, oddly enough, it's kind of poetic justice. The man who started the Reign of Terror will be the final victim of the Reign of Terror. After Robespierre's death, the terror ends, and the more radical Jacobins, like the Mountain, the followers of Robespierre, lost power, as did the Paris Commune. The National Convention created a new constitution at this point, reflecting the desire for stability, okay, to try to get rid of the dictatorship mentality. So this would be a new constitution for France. They had already written two. The first one in 1791, it was for a constitutional monarchy. The second one in 1792 when they founded a republic. And now a new one, a third one in 1795 that established a legislative assembly now that would have two chambers. It would have the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders. And if you think about it, this is kind of like, House of Lords and House of Commons that they had in the British Parliament. The House of Lords would be the Council of Elders. The Council of 500 would be more like the House of Commons, the elected body. Electors, individuals qualified to vote in the election, will choose the 750 legislatures, the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders. There were only 30,000 electors, however, in France, due to the qualification requirement of owning a certain amount of property. So we do not have voting rights for all men. We only have voting rights for wealthy men. Now, these were also upper middle class folks, of course. They were not talking just nobles. We're talking those bourgeoisie are the ones that are firmly in charge here. From a list presented by the Council of 500, the Council of Elders selected 5 directors to act as the executive committee, or the executive branch, if you will. The Council of Elders and Council of 500 would be the legislative branch, but that executive branch or committee was known as the Directory. The period of the Directory, after the fall of Robespierre, after the Reign of Terror ends, initiates another phase, a more moderate phase once again in the revolution. This period was one of government corruption, however. People reacted against the Reign of Terror's time of deprivation, some of them making great fortunes from graft. And what we'll see is some of these directors will use their positions of power to make wealth for themselves and not really look out for what's the best for the population. The Directory also faced political enemies from both royalists and radicals. It could not solve the country's economic problems any better than the Committee of Public Safety and the National Convention had under Robespierre. And it was fighting the wars begun by the Committee of Public Safety still, and those wars are expensive. The Directory relied more and more on military might to stay in power. And in 1792, ultimately, one of the people that they depended upon to protect them against the foreign powers, the foreign governments that are still fighting against them, this coup d'etat, which is a sudden overthrow of the government, was led by one of the most popular generals in the French army, Napoleon Bonaparte. This coup d'etat that was led by Napoleon Bonaparte toppled the Directory, and ultimately Napoleon will be able to take power as a result. Now, Napoleon was not even French to begin with. He was Corsican. But because his family had supported a French takeover of Corsica back during the Bourbon dynasty, his family had won the right for the children to be educated in France. He came to France right as the revolution was beginning. He went to military school. He was able to work his way up through the French military because of the changes that had been made because of the revolution. And so Napoleon was able to rise through the ranks and become a general when he wasn't even a noble. He wasn't even a bourgeoisie, really, in France anyways. This shows you the ability of social mobilization because of the French Revolution that was possible. Now let's talk about the age of Napoleon, because after the toppling of the Directory, Napoleon takes charge, and the revolution kind of comes full circle, because Napoleon will rule as an emperor eventually, and really he was more like an enlightened absolutist monarch instead of, the revolution bringing about real change in France, social reform and political reform, although there will be some political reform. We'll talk about that as we go through this. Napoleon Bonaparte dominated European history, really, from 1799 to 1815. Not just French history, but European history, because he will launch a series of wars against those nations in Europe that had tried to break down the French Revolution, and he will win for most of that time period. He'll start losing after 1812, but he will dominate world history, European history, for that amount of time. He never stopped reminding the French that he preserved what was beneficial in the revolutionary program, even though he would be ruling as an emperor. So they got rid of a king, started a republic, eventually got an emperor. So, he reminded them, look, I have saved France from foreign domination. I have saved France from the Bourbon dynasty. You need to recognize that you need me. Napoleon, however, let's talk about his background a little bit. He was born in 1769 on the Mediterranean island of Corsica. And he went to military school in France, like I said, on a royal scholarship because his father had supported a French takeover of Corsica. In 1785, he
Napoleon
was
once
commissioned
wrote,
as a lieutenant
"But
in the
let
French
that
army.
impatiently awaited Savior give a
He listed
sudden
this
sign
later.
of his existence, and the people's instinct will divine him and call upon him. The obstacles are smoothed before his steps, and a whole great nation flying to see him pass will seem to be saying, 'Here is the man.' A consecutive series of great actions never is the result of chance and luck. It always is the product of planning and genius. Great men are rarely known to fail in their most perilous enterprises. Is it because they are lucky that they become great? No, but being great, they have been able to master luck." The Mind of Napoleon, J. Christopher Harold, 1955. Napoleon possessed an overwhelming sense of his own importance. He was convinced that he was the man of destiny who would save the French people.
For the next 7 years, Napoleon educated himself in philosophy and the world's great military campaigns while he was in military school. This is how he will eventually be brought into the new French army during the French Revolution. The French Revolution and the European wars that followed, or that came about as a result of it, gave him a chance to use his knowledge and prove himself on the battlefield. By the age of only 24, Napoleon was made brigadier general by the Committee of Public Safety. So he was a supporter of Robespierre originally. He won a series of victories as the French commander against armies in Italy in the Italian campaign in the early 1790s. Napoleon's combination of intelligence, charm, wit, and decisiveness allowed him to win the support of his troops and other people. In fact, he became so popular that people would follow him rather than follow the French revolutionary government, the Directory, as we will see. He returned from some of his military campaigns in 1797 as a conquering hero. Napoleon's attempt to strike at Britain, however, by trying to take Egypt, which had become a British stronghold, threatening India, both failed, however. However, he was a master at manipulating the press and sending back false reports that he was doing better than he really was. Ultimately, when he returned home and it was obvious that it wasn't a victory in either Egypt or in India, he was able to turn the animosity for that loss on the Directory itself, the directors in the Directory government. This is because he said it was them who did not adequately support him, giving him the supplies and the backup that he needed. So this will turn the tide against the Directory. The people of France loved Napoleon. He was a winner. They believed him over the Directory, and they will support him in his coup d'etat against the Directory ultimately. In 1799, he will return to Paris, and this is when the coup begins. Napoleon took part in this coup d'etat that overthrew the Directory. Even though, in theory, France was a republic under the Directory, even though it continued to be a republic after the overthrow of the Directory, Napoleon really held absolute power as the first consul of a new government called the Consulate. He appointed members of the bureaucracy, controlled the army, conducted foreign affairs, and influenced the legislature. So in reality, he was an enlightened absolute monarch. In 1802, Napoleon made himself consul for life. And then in 1804, he decided that he would crown himself Emperor Napoleon I. So the revolution has come full circle. However, the man in charge is a byproduct of that revolution. He would have never been able to rise through the ranks in the military had it not been for the revolution. He was somebody who enshrined a lot of the ideals of the revolution and of the Enlightenment, yet others he did not. He's kind of a paradox when we look at him. In some cases, he does enshrine the ideals of the French Revolution and of the Enlightenment. In others, he doesn't, with this absolute power. Napoleon did make peace with the church, however, to restore stability to France. And this actually was a smart move because most of the peasantry in France did not like the de-Christianization that had happened during the Reign of Terror under Robespierre. He himself was an Enlightenment believer in reason, but he also recognized the importance of faith in France. In 1801, Napoleon made an agreement with the Pope that recognized Catholicism as the official religion of most of France. Once again, the Catholic Church is the official religion of France. The Pope gave up asking for the return of church lands that had been taken earlier in the Revolution. Because he knew that he would never get those back. So those would remain in the hands of those who now controlled them. With this agreement, however, Napoleon pleased both the church and those who had seized its lands, those people who had benefited from the church losing those lands. This was a smart move on Napoleon's part because now he has allies on all levels of society. Napoleon's most famous domestic achievement was codifying the French laws, creating a new legal code called the Code of Napoleon or the Napoleonic Code. Before the Revolution, France had up to 300 separate legal systems. It was so confusing, so clunky, and just too much. So the most important part of the new unified codes was the Civil Code or the Napoleonic Code. It recognized equality before the law, the right to choose a profession, religious toleration, and the end of serfdom and feudalism. These are all Enlightenment ideals. These are all things that the earliest French revolutionaries wanted guaranteed when they wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So this shows you, in some respects, he does enshrine the ideals of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. But in others, he doesn't. The code also outlawed unions and strikes. And also, he was an absolute ruler as the Emperor of France. So he's a paradox, a contradiction in terms. Napoleon's civil code also undid revolutionary changes, such as making divorce easy for both men and women, and allowing children, including daughters, to inherit property. He ended that. This is something that women had gained in the early days of the Republic, when France was declared a republic after the king had been deposed. But now, under Napoleon, women will lose a lot of those gains. The new code made it harder for women to divorce. Their husbands controlled their property when they married, and therefore their husbands could be the only ones that really could ask for divorce. Women were considered minors in lawsuits under the Napoleonic Code as well, and their testimony was considered less reliable than that of men. Napoleon developed a powerful centralized administrative machine with promotion based on ability, based on merit. Opening government careers to individuals based on their ability was one change the middle class had wanted, even back in the early days of the Revolution. So once again, this promotion by ability, promotion by merit is something that is a French revolutionary ideal, or an ideal of the Enlightenment. Napoleon created that also a new aristocracy based on merit in the state service. So civil servants were now being given noble status for their participation in the army as officers or what have you. He created about 3,263 nobles between the years 1808 and 1814. More than half of them were military officers and from the traditional middle class. So that would be seen as an ideal of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution as well. So I'm showing you, in some ways he supported the ideals of the Revolution, in some ways he, refuted them. He's a paradox. Did Napoleon preserve the ideals of the French Revolution as he claimed in his domestic policy? Well, let's take a closer look. The Civil Code recognized equality of all citizens before the law, And he did open government careers to more people. So to that extent, he did preserve the revolutionary ideals. But he also destroyed some of the revolutionary ideals. He ruled despotically, meaning absolutely. For example, he shut down 60 of France's 73 newspapers because he did not want a free press to challenge anything he was trying to do. And he insisted that the government view all manuscripts before they were published. So that's censorship of the press. And having a government police read people's mail to make sure that nobody was plotting against his government. Anne-Louise Germaine de Staël was a prominent female writer of this period who had a salon from the Enlightenment period for the powerful that lasted from 1790 to 1804. She first supported Napoleon, but then she clashed with him and denounced him as a tyrant. He banned her books and ultimately exiled her out of France. Now, what about Napoleon's empire? It will stretch beyond the borders of France. As he continues to defeat the European powers, he adds more territories to France. Napoleon's conquests began soon after he reached power. First, however, he achieved a peace treaty in 1802 with the many nations warring against France after the execution of Louis XVI. However, the next year in 1803, the war was renewed once again. So from 1805 to 1807, Napoleon's Grand Army defeated Austrians first, then the Russians and the Prussians. Napoleon could now create a new world order and control most of Europe. Now, the Russian forces that he defeated was not taking over all of Russia, however. It was just the Russian forces that were sent into Central Europe to fight against Napoleon. That would be a different thing. When Napoleon tries to invade Russia, as we will see, he will fail. His grand empire basically had three parts to it: the French Empire itself, dependent states, and allied states. Now, the words dependent states and allied states are not what you might think they mean, okay? The dependent states were basically kingdoms that Napoleon's relatives ruled. In other words, as he conquered these kingdoms, he placed members of his own family on the thrones in those territories. So they were now subservient to him because he controlled them, okay? This included Spain, Holland, or the Netherlands, Italy, and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which is a portion of what will eventually be Russia, but at this point it was its own little territory. It's basically in Poland, is what it was. The Allied states were those Napoleon defeated and forced to join him in war against Britain. Okay, now this is different. These Allied states, they're really not what we would traditionally call an ally. They were conquered states who were forced to do his will to maintain their own kind of sovereignty at home. And his will was to continue to fight against Britain. Britain was the thorn in his side that he could never quite defeat, and he would continually be fighting against Britain his entire career. Of course, we know the animosity between Great Britain and France had been going on for centuries. Okay, so these allied states, which are not really allies, they're defeated powers, okay, included Prussia, Austria, parts of Russia, and Sweden at different times during his reign. Now, eventually, he will lose control over these states, and his influence will start to be rolled back throughout Europe. Napoleon sought to spread some of the principles of the revolution, however, the French Revolution, to these areas that he now has control over, including equality before the law, religious toleration, and economic freedom. This is one way that we see Napoleon's influence will continue on long after his death throughout Europe. These things, equality before the law, religious toleration, and economic freedom, will ultimately foster nationalism and also foster the desire to keep these changes in place once France loses control of these territories and they are controlled to their previous rulers. He urged his rulers, the ones that were under his authority, his family members, and those that were, quote, allies of him, he urged his rulers to be constitutional kings, not absolute rulers, which is interesting since he really was an enlightened absolutist himself. He tried to destroy the feudal hierarchical order in the French Empire and in the dependent states. He did not want things to be the way they were before the French Revolution throughout Europe. Nobility and clergy will lose privileges, and equality of opportunity was declared instead, along with religious toleration and equality before the law. So these are ways that he enshrines the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution once again. Napoleon's spread of French revolutionary principles to these countries was an important factor in the development of classical liberal traditions in these nations, even after his decline and his defeat. The survival of Great Britain and the force of nationalism are the two main causes of the quick collapse of Napoleon's empire, however. Great Britain survived principally because of its sea power, which made Britain virtually invulnerable. They were not able to be defeated by Napoleon, largely because of that massive and successful navy. Even so, Napoleon mounted a fleet for an invasion to try to invade Great Britain. This was a mistake. Britain's defeat of a combined French-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar in 1805 ended Napoleon's dream of invading Great Britain. He would have to try to hurt Great Britain in another way. So Napoleon will try to use the continental system to defeat Britain. Now this would hit Great Britain in its pocketbook, basically. Okay, the continental system was intended to stop British goods from reaching continental markets within Europe. By cutting off their buyers for their goods, he hoped it would ultimately strangle Great Britain economically into submitting and surrendering. Allied states, quote unquote, resented, however, being told they could not buy British goods. And this strategy ultimately failed and will cause those Allied states to eventually wrench themselves free from his domination and start to attack him once again. Also, due to new markets in Latin America and the Middle East, Britain's exports reached near record highs in 1809 to 1810. They might not have been able to trade with Europe as much because of the continental system, but they found other buyers elsewhere. So, in other words, the continental system did not have the results that Napoleon had hoped. Nationalism is the cultural identity of people based on common language, common religion, and national symbols. And nationalism is something that is really born out of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. The French spread and aroused nationalism in two ways throughout these wars, these Napoleonic wars. They were both hated as oppressors, as the ones that come and conquer the other nations, okay? But French nationalism showed other countries what a nation in arms could also do. So they were hated as oppressors, but they were also admired to see, hey, what it was possible. So people thought, other nations thought, we could do the same for ourselves without having France rule over us. So it inspired nationalism in two ways. Now, Napoleon's fall, it began really in 1812 when he decided that he was going to invade Russia proper. Russia had been one of the Allied nations, but they ultimately resented the continental system so much that they pulled out of it. And this caused Napoleon to decide, no, I'm going to invade Russia to force them to kowtow to my demands once again. So Russia had refused to remain in the continental system, and this caused Napoleon to launch a massive invasion starting in 1812. The Grand Army of over 600,000 men entered Russia in 1812. Napoleon needed to score a quick and decisive victory in Russia before the winter settled in, because the winter is always Russia's best weapon. It is so harsh that most armies, if they get stuck there in the winter, perish from starvation and from hypothermia, and they are not able to defeat Russia because of it. And because Russia is so large, they can trade space for time. They can draw their enemy further and further in, wait for the Russian winter to settle in, which comes fairly early in Russia. It comes like August, and ultimately kill off their enemies that way. The Russians would not fight. They kept retreating and pulling the French forces deeper and deeper into Russia, knowing that they would get stuck once the winter settled in. Also, the Russians even burned their own villages and even Moscow, as they wanted to deny the French food and supplies. 18th century and at this point 19th century armies usually lived off the land when they were invading another territory. By the Russians burning their own territories using scorched earth tactics, yes, it will hurt them also, but it will hurt the enemy forces because they cannot recoup and they cannot resupply themselves off of the land. They can't even feed themselves. And this would be a big problem for Napoleon. Lacking food, Napoleon ultimately left Moscow after 2 months to retreat. The Russian Tsar would not submit. He would not surrender. And ultimately, Napoleon got stuck in the ice and snow. He started his retreat in October. This great retreat happened under terrible winter conditions. And remember what I said, he entered Russia with 600,000 men. He left Russia with only 40,000 men, arriving back in Poland where they started from. That is a huge amount of losses. Over 560,000 people died. Over 500,000 folks. Other European nations, now seeing his weakness, will rise up and attack the French army. And the European coalition of forces against France, against Napoleon will be renewed, if you will. Between 1812 and 1814, Napoleon lost more and more battles, losing more and more territory that he had gained in Central Europe before. By 1814, Napoleon lost control over Paris, the capital city in France, and Napoleon himself, instead of being executed by the foreign powers that defeated him, which were Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain primarily, instead they exiled him to the island of Elba that was just off the coast of France. Now, why did they do this and not kill him? Well, because Napoleon was still so very popular among the people of France. He was like Mickey Mouse, y'all. That they worried that if they killed him, there would be an uprising within France and the French Revolution would begin all over again. And they just wanted that to end. So they thought the best thing to do was to allow him to live, but exile him to the island of Elba. Well, folks, Elba was not far away enough because Napoleon will escape Elba and try to come back and retake Paris within a year. Now, in the meantime, though, while he is in Elba, the brother of Louis XVI will be named by those other nations in Europe as the new king of France. He will be Louis XVIII. Why is he Louis XVIII and not Louis XVII? He takes the number 18 instead of 17 out of respect for his nephew, who had been the prince, okay, who died in prison during the Revolution. So there was no Louis XVII. He takes the number 18 out of respect, okay? So the Bourbon monarchy is restored under Louis XVIII, but the king had very little support because the people of France still loved Napoleon. They loved him so much. He was a winner. Everybody loves a winner. And even when he was a loser, he was still more of a winner than Louis XVIII, who was a big old fat guy who just did nothing but, live off of the people and not really give them anything at all. So, because Napoleon still had so much support at home, when he escaped Elba, he had a base of support already there for him to use. This will be known as Napoleon's 100 Days, because this escape from Elba and the subsequent battle he fights only lasts 100 days, and he will fail once again. Troops were sent to capture him, but on their meeting, Napoleon invited anyone to try to kill him, and no one did. Instead, the troops shouted, "Vive l'Empereur! Long live the Emperor!" because they still loved him and they still supported him. Napoleon then entered Paris with the French troops that were not supportive of Louis XVIII. They were supportive of Napoleon instead. He entered Paris in triumph on March 20th, 1815. And the European powers and Napoleon, whom they called the enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world, fought once again. The last battle will be at Waterloo in Belgium, the Battle of Waterloo in Belgium, 1815. Napoleon will be defeated by a combined British and Prussian army under the Duke of Wellington, the British officer. This will be Napoleon's final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Once again, however, they did not kill him. They exiled him, but this time they exiled him to St. Helena, an island in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the Atlantic, the South Atlantic Ocean. It is here on St. Helena that Napoleon will die in 1824 under suspicious circumstances. It appeared at first that he died of disease, but there are some people that think he might have been poisoned. He might have had stomach cancer. We're not really sure, but that, of course, adds to the lore, if you will. Napoleon is dead in 1824, but his legacy will continue to influence Europe for many, many generations that we'll continue to talk about in later units. Like I said, St. Helena, small island in the South Atlantic. Napoleon's power was ended, and when he dies, his influence will still be there.